Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my running back strength of schedule for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're talking about everything related to the strength of schedule at the running back position, talking about which running backs have the most advantageous or disadvantageous matchups going into the 2021 season. For those of you who are familiar with the channel, I always mention schedule throughout the regular season because the impact of the defense that you're playing against on a weekly basis makes a huge difference in fantasy football in terms of us predicting what is going to potentially happen. If we're talking about a defense like the Detroit Lions last year, giving up 30 fantasy points per week to opposing running backs, of course, we wanted to start our running backs against them on a weekly basis because they had a history of games in which they were giving up 20, 30, sometimes 40 total points to a singular team to their running back position. So, again, we're talking about, of course, the storied history of some of these defenses, but predicting how these defenses are going to potentially play this upcoming season because they're not going to look the same as last year. As rookies come in, free agents move around, we'll talk about all the implications and all the statistics that I broke down for this video alone in order to give us the best possible perspective as to what the strength of schedule presents to us this upcoming season for the running back position and which running backs we should specifically be going after this upcoming season. Of course, we'll also talk about who has the most advantageous matchups from weeks 1 through 7, weeks 8 through 14, and for the fantasy football playoffs this upcoming season. All of that encompassed in this singular video. So if you haven't yet already and you're hyped up to talk about strength of schedule, make sure you smash that like button. And of course, for those of you who have not yet already, subscribe to the channel. We're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2021 season. For the rest of this week, of course, we'll be talking about strength of schedule as I'll put out the videos for the wide receiver, quarterback, and tight end position. And we have a lot of content coming your way every single day from this channel going into the regular season as I try to help you capture some 2021 fantasy football championships. So if you haven't yet, click that subscribe button down below. Make sure you click that bell notification button to stay up to date on my latest content. As soon as my video drops, lets you know as soon as I go live, as I've been live streaming as of late the last couple of days. It'll let you know. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention before we begin today's video is that Andrew Kirchhoff's 2021 Fantasy Football Draft Guide is available. For those of you who are trying to get an edge on the rest of your league, go down to the description of the video. You can either check out my Patreon or the website and purchase the 2021 Fantasy Football Draft Guide. For those of you who are interested, thank you very much in advance. All right, let's go ahead and let's start talking about strength of schedule. We want to get right into it. We're not wasting any time. This is going to be a longer video because I've got a lot to say. So again, the strength of schedule makes a huge impact in terms of the decisions we make on a weekly basis. If a running back is playing against one of the easier teams in terms of teams that are giving up a lot of points to opposing running backs on a weekly basis on average, then of course we want to take advantage of that. If they're playing against some of the tougher teams, as you can see to the right of me, right here on the bottom, the number 32 ranked team is the New Orleans Saints because last season they gave up only 15.99 fantasy points per game. But as the list to the right of me kind of presents, those were last season's stats, the 2020 fantasy points allowed versus running backs. Of course, like I mentioned earlier, the Detroit Lions gave up the most points to opposing running backs, all the way down to the New Orleans Saints. So we kind of have a little bit of an understanding as to how these teams performed last year in terms of their defenses versus opposing running backs on a weekly basis in a half PPR scoring format. Now, to the right of that, we go ahead and we see the title 2020 running backs SOS, which is strength of schedule in 2021. Now, if in fact I was to go ahead and just grab the strength of schedule that has been determined by last season's statistics and players, and I implemented it into this upcoming season's schedule, of course, an 18-week season with 17 games played, we would potentially find that the Pittsburgh Steelers has the easiest strength of schedule, which is obviously great for a guy like Najee Harris, along with the Colts, the Cleveland Browns, two of the running backs that were on today's thumbnail, of course, Jonathan Taylor and Nick Chubb, along with the Los Angeles Chargers, Chicago Bears, etc. Now, you'd also see on the bottom of the list, of course, teams like the Las Vegas Raiders, Dallas Cowboys, New York Giants, Carolina Panthers, and Buccaneers would have the toughest strength of schedule. But if we were going to use last season's stats to predict this season, I don't personally believe that was going to be the best way of handling these metrics. So I went ahead and I did a lot of research and I put together a lot of things that hopefully you guys appreciate because it really did take a good chunk of time in order to break this down. Though these statistics on screen aren't our immediate answer, we're going to reference back to them because they'll play a role in helping us find what the answer is to our strength of schedule this upcoming season. Now, I wanted to go ahead and present a couple more statistics because again, I went ahead and approached finding the strength of schedule at the running back position in a little bit of a different way. So similar to last season, I went ahead and I broke down every single player's defensive stat in terms of stopping the run last season. Now, of course, we start ahead from every single, defensive line to linebackers to even safeties and cornerbacks, because stopping the run is a team, objective. You don't want to go ahead and just isolate the front seven, because the front seven, though they're majority of the guys making the tackles in the running game, safeties and corners do have to come and step up and make plays in the running game. So I went ahead and got the average score of every single team in terms of stopping the run last season in terms of total grades. And we'll see that the New Orleans Saints averaged out at a .6563 average grade out of 100, so it would have been a total of 1 last season, in comparison to the Houston Texans averaging a 52.37 grade per every single defender on their team last season. Now, of course, I wanted to go ahead and include the entire defense, corners, safeties, all of the above, but I also wanted to include second stringers, because there are specialists that come in nickel backs, nose tackles that typically aren't there. There are different pass rush specialists that come in and still have to play downs in which they have to stop the run. So I wanted to encompass all of that, and I did so. Therefore, we found that, of course, the New Orleans Saints have the toughest run-stopping defense, followed by the Washington Football Team, New England Patriots this upcoming season, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which looks pretty similar to the last list that we talked about in terms of teams not allowing a lot of points to opposing running backs, which, of course, similarly correlates, because as you see to the bottom, the Houston Texans and the Detroit Lions have some of the worst overall graded players in terms of stopping the run. Now, with the 2021 team defensive grade, of course, I went ahead and included rookies being brought in and free agents. So let's say, for example, let's talk about J.J. Watt. J.J. Watt went to the Arizona Cardinals this offseason. He had a total grade of 81 in terms of stopping the run. So what I went ahead and did is I applied that to that team, because that is what they're going to get contributed from J.J. Watt this upcoming season. So if in fact we get a team that has rookies, I went ahead and found the average grade of rookies from last season, applied it to them. Everything's pretty much been taken care of. Now, of course, we're still sitting in the offseason, and rosters and defenses aren't fully committed, and it could potentially change. I went ahead and I applied this upon the 18-week season of the 2021 year to figure out what the graded RB strength of schedule in 2021 would have looked like, which is on the very right side of the screen. With that applied, we found that the average strength of schedule amongst all teams in the National Football League would have pretty much panned out having the Cleveland Browns, Denver Broncos, Pittsburgh Steelers, Baltimore Ravens with the easiest strength of schedule this upcoming season, with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Carolina Panthers all the way at the bottom with the toughest strength of schedule. Now, we've gone ahead and broken it down two ways. First, breaking it down from what last season looked like. Second, figuring out how well teams and players are in terms of stopping the run. And what I decided to do was to combine all of those statistics to determine what we'll potentially see this upcoming season. So our final strength of schedule for this upcoming season has been determined by the averages of both of those charts, and calculating them all together and doing a lot of scripts in Excel to find that this is our 2021 strength of schedule at the running back position, with the Pittsburgh Steelers, Cleveland Browns, Denver Broncos, Indianapolis Colts, Chicago Bears leading the pack with the easiest strength of schedule going into this upcoming season. And there's a lot of implications for, regarding that. Let's talk about the running backs there just really quickly at glance, because we'll certainly go into it more as the episode progresses. But of course, the Steelers with Najee Harris. I know a lot of people talk about his offensive line not being great, but he's in a division where, of course, there's a couple teams, the Cleveland Browns and the Cincinnati Bengals, that you can take advantage of on the ground. That's 4 games out of a season, on top of the fact that their schedule is very promising this upcoming year, starting off very well, which we'll talk about more as we progress throughout the episode. But that's huge for a rookie running back that is getting currently the exposure of the first round selection, potentially being even selected in the second round, may give you more credence to potentially select them. Other running backs like, of course, Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt with the Cleveland Browns, Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon from the Denver Broncos. Of course, Indianapolis Colts. The question is, can we trust, the backfield? If Carson Wentz is going to be hurt, if their guard is going to be out for a couple weeks because he's injured to get surgery, are we going to potentially see that the Indianapolis Colts can give Jonathan Taylor the opportunity to take over? Chicago Bears. A lot of people have questions about David Montgomery. If you guys remember last offseason, we talked about the strength of schedule at the running back position. And who was at the very top? The Chicago Bears. And did David Montgomery disappoint? He absolutely did not. So maybe this goes ahead and gives us more confidence in players like this. The Los Angeles Chargers with, of course, Austin Eckler getting more and more exposure. But now that we talk about Austin Eckler, I, of course, want to talk about receptions. So keep that in mind. We'll get to that in a second. The last thing I wanted to continue to just point out is, though these teams are potentially going to have the easiest strength of schedules this upcoming season at the running back position, let's not go ahead and misconstrue these statistics. When you look at the Dallas Cowboys, Atlanta Falcons, New York Giants, Carolina Panthers at the bottom, okay, we're talking about potentially 4 great running backs this upcoming season: Ezekiel Elliott, Mike Davis, Saquon Barkley, and Christian McCaffrey. I want you to just kind of understand that there are some running backs that are, regardless of the schedule that they're going to face, matchup proof. No matter what happens, whatever defense they play up against, yes, they're going to have potentially some bad weeks, but as a whole, you shouldn't be, fading these players based on their strength of schedule. Certainly, it's a variable in the entire case of a player, but it isn't the defining statistic as to whether you go for it. But again, I'm just expressing to you that I've seen players have terrible strength of schedules, but still produce RB1 seasons. So take that in mind and don't take this at face value and start to fade those players, because Christian McCaffrey, regardless of having the second toughest strength of schedule this upcoming season, is going to be my number 1 pick all season long. So just taking that into account. Now, like I mentioned, with the Los Angeles Chargers and Austin Eckler, and now Christian McCaffrey, both of those running backs are very much so going to benefit from receptions, targets, getting themselves involved in the passing game. And though you may be thinking, Andrew, the strength of schedule, you've only gone ahead and covered run stopping ability. You haven't really covered the reception game and how valuable that is for the running back position, especially when there's guys like Christian McCaffrey and Austin Eckler potentially getting themselves over 100 targets this year, maybe if in fact they get lucky, over 100 receptions. And if in fact that's going to be the case, it's going to play a big deal in terms of their total fantasy productivity, especially in a half or a full PPR. And I 100% agree with you. And that's when I, kind of this offseason thought about, and I reviewed it and I thought to myself, well, where do receptions and targets and the fantasy points that are gained from the receiving game, how does it impact and where does it potentially apply in this metric? Let's go ahead and show you. So as you can see on screen, we have the 2020 team receiving statistics. So from top to bottom, we have the total fantasy points scored from backfields from every single respective team. The New Orleans Saints, their backfield running backs, scored the most points in the receiving game. So statistics gained from receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. And all the way on the bottom, the Baltimore Ravens, scoring the least amount of points in that specific category. Now, the reason I wanted to go ahead and show you these statistics is because, of course, the receiving game plays a huge part in the total fantasy point productivity and effectiveness and at times consistency of a running back. A lot of running backs that aren't getting that half or full point per reception every single week, a handful of times, aren't going to have the extra upside as other running backs are exposed to. So, of course, there's value here to be had. But I wanted to go ahead and figure out if, in fact, there is a potential change of pace. Is there a potential for running backs to see more, exposure in the receiving game or less exposure to the receiving game based on strength of schedule? Is strength of schedule going to play a part in a running back's upside this upcoming season? So I looked at teams like the New Orleans Saints, the Indianapolis Colts, Chargers, Washington football team, New England Patriots, these teams that targeted their running backs a lot and did it more than just about anybody this last season. And I wanted to figure out, okay, do these teams, regardless of the team that they play, still target their running backs based on strength of schedule? So let's go ahead and let's talk about the Los Angeles Chargers, because we wanted to talk about Austin Eckler earlier and I referred to it. Now, as you can see, the first column says versus. Those are the teams that the Los Angeles Chargers played against last year from weeks 1 through 17 to 16 contests. Now, to the right of that is the rank column. Based on how many points per game they gave up to opposing running backs, they were ranked 1 through 32. 1 meaning they were the best team against opposing running backs. They allowed the fewest points, and 32 being they gave up a lot of points to opposing running backs per week in a half PPR scoring format. How many points exactly are we talking about? That's to the column to the right of that, fantasy points allowed. Like the Cincinnati Bengals, of course, they were number 12, which means they were giving up a few amount of points. They only allowed 6.02 fantasy points per game, while the next team after that, the Kansas City Chiefs, were ranked 31 and were giving up the second most points to opposing running backs in a half PPR scoring format in the receiving category. Now, to the right of that statistic is FPT, which is fantasy points. Those are the amount of fantasy points that the Los Angeles Chargers scored last season in those specific contests in the receiving game. Now, if you go to the very right of that, the final column, we have the over-under, which is the difference between the fantasy points allowed of every team that they played against and the fantasy points that they scored. So basically the difference between the two, and if they were meeting the potential of the matchup or being stifled by it. Now, if we go ahead and take all the statistics from the 16 games that the Los Angeles Chargers played, which I did with many teams, and you go to the very bottom, we see the 4 tabs of difficulty, games, fantasy point over and under, and fantasy points per game. Of the contests that they played, the 16 games, we had 5 difficult matchups, 7 medium matchups in terms of how many points were allowed to opposing offenses in terms of the running back position, and we had 4 easy matchups. Now, in those 16 contests, we would have anticipated, just off of surface level value, that potentially the difficult matchups, the hard matchups in this case, would have been a trouble for the Los Angeles Chargers, while the easy and the medium ones would have been just easier cakewalks. And though the easy matchups were a cakewalk, as when the Los Angeles Chargers played against teams that were giving up a lot of points to opposing running backs in the receiving game, of course they benefited from that, they exposed that, and they produced well. But the thing that was the biggest difference maker, and something that I saw consistently throughout many teams, is that regardless of the defense you play against, whether it's an easy, medium, or difficult, hard challenge based on fantasy points allowed, if your team is a team that targets the running back a lot, specifically like the Los Angeles Chargers or the New Orleans Saints, regardless of the difficulty of the matchup, you always benefited because targets were going to be there. It's more about scheme rather than exposing a defense. And that is a theme that I saw throughout the entirety of this breakdown. For teams that already consistently pass the ball to their running backs on a weekly basis, regardless of what they play against, they're always going to continue to feed their running backs because it's a matter of scheme. Now, if we go ahead and we look at a potential offense that doesn't target their running backs, the Baltimore Ravens, in fact, they had the least amount of points for their running backs in terms of receiving points, receptions, yardage, and touchdowns. When we looked at their entire breakdown from the teams they played, the rankings, of course, the over-under, the fantasy points they scored, they played 9 difficult and hard matchups, 5 mediums, and 2 easies. Regardless of what they played against, they still never increased the amount of points to a significant enough value to where we're thinking, yes, we can act upon fantasy points and the matchups and the strength of schedule of the receiving game, because no matter what I did, when I looked at a lot of teams, yes, there were some outliers, but the vast majority, if you target your running backs, then you're always going to find value regardless of matchup. And that's what I found. And that's why I wanted to go ahead and kind of cover this. As we move on, I want to cover our final section for today and talk about greater spans of time that we could potentially take advantage of going into the 2021 season. Now, of course, we've already talked about who has the greatest strength of schedule this upcoming season. Najee Harris's of the world, Nick Chubb, Jonathan Taylor, David Montgomery benefiting from it. And yes, there are some running backs that are going to be struggling for majority of the season based on the matchups they have, but some of them are perhaps guys that are matchup proof, that are always going to succeed, whether that is the benefit of their receiving work or not going forward. I want to talk about spans of time in the 3 sections of time throughout this upcoming season that are extremely vital. Of course, we have weeks 1 through 7, weeks 8 through 14, and the final 3 weeks of everyone's season, which you should have, which is weeks 15, 16, and 17. This upcoming season, we have an 18-week season, but we do not want to be playing championship games in week 18 because, again, the NFL playoffs are the week after that, and if teams are going to hold out their starters, we don't want to be in the scenario in which we don't have our studs starting because they want to rest their players. With that in mind, that's just a public service announcement. Let's talk about the strength of schedule at the running back position from weeks 1 through 7 of this upcoming season. Now, for many of these teams, they're either playing 7 games or 6 games because there are a couple teams that have bye weeks starting in week 6. But as you can see on screen, based on the values that I've gone ahead and calculated, the Jacksonville Jaguars, Pittsburgh Steelers, Baltimore Ravens currently are at the top of the list in terms of the easiest strength of schedule going into this upcoming season from weeks 1 through 7. It's very apparent from the Jacksonville Jaguars schedule that we have gone ahead and presented. They play against the Houston Texans, Denver Broncos, Arizona Cardinals, Cincinnati Bengals, Tennessee Titans, Miami Dolphins didn't get into a week 7 bye. Based on the schedule, Houston is an easy cakewalk. Arizona doesn't have that great of a run stopping defense. Cincinnati has been exposed a lot over the last couple of years, and so has Tennessee. Though they have a tough week 2 schedule, this team is obviously going to throw the ball, whether you do have Travis Etienne or not. That you're going to benefit from that if in fact you have that piece and you are playing against a tougher team like the Denver Broncos. Also the Miami Dolphins, they've shown that they are a decent team but not one of the better ones. They have the easiest strength of schedule on average. That is what the 11.42 is. It is a culmination of the number in which they're valued at in terms of a 1 through 32 basis. And of course, it is chronologically sent downward. Now, the reason why I show you these statistics is, of course, to try to take advantage of it and to explode it against our leagues. We're looking for players that are potentially going to have very easy strength of schedules off the rip that we could potentially grab for very cheap value and maybe go ahead and flip them after the first 6 weeks of the season if, in fact, the rest of their season looks like a dumpster fire in terms of very difficult matchups going forward. Now, of the running backs that are, of course, near the top end and the easiest strength of schedule, who are some of the guys that I'm looking at that I potentially want to invest in going into the 2021 season based on strength of schedule? Though there aren't many options that have cheap price tags per se, because again, if you're looking for Najee Harris, J.K. Dobbins, Dalvin Cook, Nick Chubb, teams that are at the top, Joe Mixon, you're not going to find a lot of great value there. But when we talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars, Travis Etienne, maybe even James Robinson could be very valuable at the beginning of the season if they're splitting snaps. Then we look at the number 7 ranked team in terms of easiest strength of schedule, San Francisco 49ers. Whether that is Raheem Mostert or Trey Sermon, you can get value out of either of them. Then you move to the next team, the Arizona Cardinals. We don't really see Chase Edmonds being drafted relatively early. We know, James Conner's coming off of an offseason which he had, toe injury and the toe surgery. He's kind of been abrasive in terms of his ability to kind of get back in a full stride. So maybe we can go ahead and take advantage there. And the final couple options that are kind of crazy, but again, they're options nonetheless based on strength of schedule. The Houston Texans, whether you end up finding, whether it's Phillip Lindsay, Mark Ingram, or David Johnson, I know it's a running back by committee, but maybe one of them breaks out. Maybe if, in fact, you can guess the right one, you might find value in that backfield per se. So just putting this in perspective, trying to understand who has the easiest strength of schedule from weeks 1 through 7. And of course, we want to pay attention to which running backs there are, because if we can get into the second half of the season, weeks 8 through 14, and realize, wow, their second half of their schedule isn't looking great, maybe I want to sell them. Or hey, the New York Giants, Seattle Seahawks, Atlanta Falcons, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Green Bay Packers, they all have relatively difficult schedules in the beginning. Maybe if in fact I can go ahead, sit here, wait patiently, and let the Saquon Barkley, Chris Carson, Aaron Jones league manager get frustrated with the production early, I can go ahead, sit back, wait, throw in a cheap bid, make a trade for said player, and then benefit from their production that they're going to have for the rest of the season. There's a game within the game of fantasy football, and it's being able to predict the future in this manner and being able to kind of take the advantage of your league mates and go ahead and make trades when they're struggling, because the Seattle Seahawks have to play against Indianapolis right off the rip. If Chris Carson doesn't put up a great performance, I think he's going to, but let's say he doesn't, and the league manager's like, all right, I'm done, get him off my hands, overreaction Monday, then you go in and throw in an offer and you just benefit from it the rest of the season. Let's talk about weeks 8 through 14. The Los Angeles Rams, throughout this span of time, have the easiest strength of schedule, of course. It's apparent. You play against Houston, Tennessee, then you go on a bye week after San Francisco, which I guess could be a tougher matchup. But then you get to play against Green Bay, Jacksonville, Arizona. Relatively easy matchups at the running back position. Honest cakewalks, in my opinion, regardless of who's the starting running back there, which hopefully by then it'll still be Darrell Henderson, all things considered. It is a long season. It is a marathon. But just looking at the easiest strength of schedules at the position, it's drastically different in comparison between weeks 1 through 7. And that's why I wanted to point this out, because we didn't talk about the Chiefs, the Rams, the Dolphins, Colts, Raiders having easier strength of schedules in the first 7 weeks. In fact, we talked about Jaguars, who are at number 27 now. It's going to be a paradigm shift of sorts as we get into the second half of the season. But just throwing this on screen, just so you're aware, as we get kind of close to that fantasy playoff schedule, these are the teams that are going to be at their highest potential peak of value based on the defenses they play on a weekly basis. Now, of the teams that I potentially want to invest in, it just depends on if these guys are highly valued by them, because by the time we get to week 8, it could look very drastically different in terms of what the strength of schedule is. I'll obviously put out updated videos, but in terms of the Chiefs, if Clyde Edwards is cheap by then and you want to go and invest in him, I don't mind having Clyde Edwards against Green Bay, Las Vegas, Dallas, and then Las Vegas again in week 14. And then let's see what the fantasy football playoffs potentially throws at us. Now, speaking of the fantasy football playoffs, now that I've shown you these statistics, let's talk about weeks 15, 16, and 17, the moneymaker, where fantasy football separates the men and the boys. This is where you capture a championship. And as you can see on screen, the Los Angeles Chargers, Denver Broncos, San Francisco 49ers, Atlanta Falcons, Cleveland Browns are at the top of the list in terms of the easiest strength of schedule in our playoff rounds and potentially championship week. You want to go ahead and beforehand, yes, have this in mind, but it shouldn't dictate where you're drafting. It shouldn't be like, oh, you know what? The Chargers are the easiest fantasy football playoff strength of schedule, therefore I'm taking Eckler. That shouldn't be your mindset. It should just be a matter of, do I have Eckler? Great, that's going to benefit me in the long run. But maybe when you get closer to the playoffs and that trade deadline's coming around and you have a team that's built for the future, and okay, I'm getting the first round bye. I want to get into the playoffs and succeed. I need to get to the championship. I got to win. The Chiefs, we talked about them earlier. They were giving up 9.45 fantasy points per game just in the receiving game. Houston is just an absolute shambles every single week defensively. They don't know what they're doing over there. Not bad to say the least. These are stats that, of course, we're going to talk about all season long. I just wanted to go ahead, show you guys, give you some perspective as to where the strength of schedule currently stands based on all the calculations from last year, the new implemented players and free agents for every team in the run-stopping defense. Of course, the passing game, though it is extremely vital, doesn't play a big role because running backs who are targeted in offenses that are actively targeting them and have schemes where they're using running backs in the passing game, they're always going to find value regardless of matchup, and that has been a theme I've seen over the years. This is basically it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I put in a lot of time and effort, and hopefully this kind of gives you some perspective as to what we're looking at going into the 2021 season. To finish today's video, I of course want to go ahead and once again review our 2021 regular season strength of schedule from weeks 1 through 17, what we can anticipate to see. A lot of the running backs at the top are very exciting. Do not be tricked and think, Christian McCaffrey, 31. I see it every year. People panic. Don't panic. Studs are studs for a reason. And you want to start your studs every week, regardless of matchup. Now, sometimes, of course, when you play against the Saints or the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, you got to be careful. But all in all, this is the strength of schedule for the running back position going into the 2021 season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Again, if you haven't subscribed already, click that subscribe button. Join the community. Click that like button if you like today's content. We'll be talking about the wide receiver position tomorrow. My fantasy football draft guide is now available. Check that out in the description of the video, whichever way you want to go ahead and acquire that. Thank you, everybody. And until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.